hover over the deep that has opened up, to breathe into us once again the breath of life. For we are in great travail, all who bear the breath of life, and we do not know what to do. Instill within all medical teams and world leaders a spirit of wisdom, to understand, to discern, to learn, to teach, and to do, a spirit of counsel and might to renew their strength, and instill within all of us a spirit of knowledge to protect ourselves, and the fear of God to care for our fellow, the weary, the exhausted, and infirm, and to honor our elders. Bless us with a spirit of forbearance, for we have not enough strength against this great multitude that comes against us. And fulfill through us that which is written, thus said God the Lord, creator of the heavens, who lays down the earth and its offspring, who gives breath to the people upon it, and life breath to those who walk on it. I, the Lord, have called you in righteousness and held your hand and protected you. Amen.
Amen.
All of you, good health and protection and the ability to, perhaps to help others who are in need as well. And I encourage you, to write your own words, to do what you think is possible, to sort of focus on how to encourage or bring healing. We need to bring healing for each one of us, because there's no way that we can emerge from what's happening without it somehow having affected us. Right? It's not so simple. We may be healthy, but we've all been touched by this, and and we're not the same any longer. So we need the strengthening, and we need the support of each other, for sure, and an inner strength. So this is what I want to do as you know, we're going to deal with this whole question about the 10 plagues. I'm going to try them or see what lesson we can draw from the 10 plagues that is somehow relevant to our current situation. I'm going to do so by making a number of claims about the plagues, that they represent a battle between, most significantly, between monotheism and paganism, that they're about the reversal of creation into chaos, and that they're about an ecological, an environmental disaster that was brought upon Egypt. How, why? That's what we're going to see. And then, as I said, we'll try to understand how that applies, or what lessons there are that we can draw from the plague narrative. Because it seems to me that's what we have to do anyway. We study the Torah and we read the narrative on Pesach night. If we have some time at the end, then what I'll try, with those of you who remain, I have a couple of Haggadot. I always like to share with people the beauty of the Haggadah. I have the Moss Haggadah with me. I want to share a couple of pages from the most treasured, the most illuminated Jewish book, the most published Jewish book, the book of which I think there are more copies than any other book, and that's the Haggadah. And I hope that everybody is prepared, with a proper Haggadah, or with your Haggadah that talks to you and that's able to bring life to your Seder. Now, in terms of our beginning here, but I also want to say that anybody who has a comment, a question, please interrupt. I guess maybe you can raise your hand. I don't see everybody now. I don't know. Somehow you gave me the. Did you do this? I'm occupying the screen here, and I see only a few faces.
Yeah, we can change it. Is that better?
I'd rather see more people rather than myself.
Okay.
Honestly, I'm a little self-conscious anyway. So the other thing is this.
We love you, Chaim.
We love you.
Yes. So I'd like people to feel free to raise the questions, to raise questions if they have them. All right. So let me begin.
Chaim, should I attach the source sheet for everyone to see?
Yeah, if everybody, yeah.
Okay, I sent a link in the chat to everybody. If you don't have access to the source sheet, there's a tiny URL in the chat that you can open up, and it'll be a link to that.
Okay. I mean, the source sheets are not essential, but they will be helpful in terms of illustrating some aspects of what I'm trying, the claim that I'm making. Now, what's the purpose? What's the articulated purpose of the plagues? And then I also raised the question about why you need so many. It certainly would have been possible for God, the Creator, to simply redeem the Israelites. I guess one plague would have been sufficient. Maybe no plagues would have been necessary. Just somehow paralyzing the Egyptians magically one night, and the Israelites could leave Egypt without all this destruction. So the Torah does tell us what this is really all about, and I'll refer to verses. You can look them up afterwards. If you have a Bible handy, you can look for them now. For instance, Exodus 12:12 reads, "Uvachol Elohei Mitzrayim eseh shvatim." I'm going to punish shvatim. I'm going to hit all of the gods of Egypt. So it seems to be that the Torah articulates clearly that the plagues are a battle between the God of Israel and the gods of Egypt. And the God of Israel is intent on defeating the gods of Egypt. In Numbers 33:4, we read, "Uve'eloheihem asa Hashem shvatim," and and to their gods, God punished them. Hashem punished them. He hit them. He whacked them. Right? In another verse in Exodus, we read, "V'hotzeti et ami me'eretz Mitzrayim." It's chapter 7, verse 4. I will redeem my people or take my people out of Egypt, bishvatim gedolim, with great acts of punishment. V'yadu Mitzrayim ki ani Hashem, and the Egyptians will know that I am God. So one primary lesson here is to defeat the gods of Egypt so that the Egyptians understand who the God of Israel is. What's the battle that's going on here? This is one example of how the Bible presents us with the mission of Israel. Israel's mission is to defeat, to argue against, to eliminate paganism as a force in the world. Now, this is not a power battle. I'm going to show you who the real God is. There's something beyond merely, God defeating the gods. Why is it necessary for God to defeat the gods of Egypt? Now, that's why the Torah presents this story in the context of slavery, because there's a link between the gods of Egypt, Pharaoh, and the enslavement of the Jewish people. And there's a moral argument. This is a morality tale. There's a moral argument that's being made that the pagan tradition that allows a king or an emperor to arise who claims to have divine power, given the fact that that king himself is either connected to the gods or is a god, claims to be a god among the gods. That tradition has allowed throughout history human beings to claim to be masters over other human beings. Now, the battle between monotheism and let's call it idolatry is not a battle that was simply fought in antiquity and it's done. It hasn't finished, I'm sorry to say. I mean, I'm not interested in plagues today and in fighting today, but I have to say there's a lot of idolatry today. And there's a lot of rulers who rule with a sense that they are divine. and they make claims about themselves. And I don't see that so different from what Pharaoh claimed. Now, in the Bible, we see explicitly that in the book of Ezekiel. Let me find my sheet with a quote. I don't see. Where is my quote? Excuse me for a second, because I don't seem to have it right here. Well, all right, maybe. Okay. I think it's in Ezekiel chapter 29. The Ezekiel says in the name of Pharaoh, that Pharaoh proclaims, Li Yaori, I think it's 29:3. Li Yaori va'ani asitini. The Nile, Yaori, my Nile is mine, and I made it. Pharaoh is the god of Egypt. He's the god of the Nile. The Nile is worshipped in Egypt. It's the life force in Egypt. Egypt can't survive without a functioning Nile. As you know, the whole settlement of Egypt, or the vast, the huge majority, what is it, 80% of the Egyptian population lives along the Nile. It gives life to, and it gave life to an entire civilization. Li Yaori, Pharaoh claims. The Nile is me. It's mine. Vani asitini. And God tells Moses, Re'ei netaticha Elohim leFaro. I think in chapter 7. I'm sorry, I can't find the exact reference here, verse. I'll find it later. But God says to Moses, Re'ei netaticha Elohim leFaro. I have made you an Elohim to Pharaoh. You can lord it over Pharaoh, right? And you're going to be able to defeat him. Now, what's the nature of the battle? What's so significant about monotheism? So first of all, apart from the fact that there's a numerical difference, which I think is really the least consequential aspect of the difference between monotheism and paganism. We see it right away in the creation story, which is astounding. In the monotheistic tradition, the one God who is the creator, does something that no other God has done and seen in history. And that is that God creates every human being in God's image. And I don't know a God who wants to say that the people who serve me are in my image, because that seems to imply that we have a dimension, every single one of us has a dimension of God in us. What God wants to share their godliness with everybody? God wants to be God. God wants to rule. The God of Israel, or the God, let's even not make a claim that's a God of Israel. It's the God of the one God belief. That God is not threatened, has enough confidence to be able to create humanity in God's image so that every human being is endowed with infinite value. So in a tradition of the one God, it's impossible for the ruler to claim that I have the right to master and lord it over anybody. Because no one has the right to lord it over us. We're a really subversive people, I want to. The history of Israel and the history of the one God believers should be a history of people who reject all forms of arbitrary authority and authoritarianism. Because there's really there's one authority. That's the freeing dimension of the one God. We don't owe it to any human. We have to free ourselves of that tendency that we have to submit to other human beings, to submit to our instincts, to submit to the things that we allow to rule over us, and transcend those aspects of ourselves. And we all have the potential to do that. It seems to me it's an amazing message. To my great dismay, by the way, there are plenty of religious teachers who act, I wouldn't say, it's a harsh thing to say that they act like pharaohs, but they act with a certain arbitrary authority, and they claim that God speaks to them, and that by that right, they have the right to tell you what should be done. I listened, I must say, I listened for I don't know, was it 40 minutes or so to her, because it just intrigued me. This rabbi who claimed to understand what this virus is all about, and he proclaimed that he knows that the virus is not about death, the virus is a messenger from God. I mean, and there are lots of other people who also know all of that. Some preachers among them who tell people that with impunity they should come to public gatherings in the church or in the synagogue because they're sort of beyond the possibility. They know that they're protected in some way. Those are people we have to be wary of. There are too many of them that argue in the name of God, and I would say argue falsely. This is it seems to be a major aspect of the confrontation in Egypt. So let me sort of spell that out theologically, draw it out theologically. The battle between monotheism and paganism is a battle between what in antiquity was a nature-based religion where the gods were forces of nature, gods of nature, and the God of creation who says, I created nature. Nature is not what you need to worship or what controls you. I am beyond nature, and I manifest myself. That's what's so interesting in history, meaning in relationship. And the great claim made by the one God is the God who says that everybody's created in God's image is that I have a relationship with, I care about human beings. I care about creation. And you, human beings, since you're created in my image, you have the task to make sure that my caring is carried out, right? Because I'm not around all the time doing all these things. You have to do it. This is a tradition that empowers us and that recognizes in our presence before God that we have enormous creative capacity, having been created in God's image. So number one, the theological background is that the ancients had a religion of nature, and the monotheists introduced the notion of a God of history, a God who's part of the human experience, who is beyond nature, but who's involved with human beings. If you could accept that, I mean, it's such an interesting formulation. So that's the first dimension. Now, as a result of that aspect, there are some real consequences to that. What we know about nature, the book of Ecclesiastes tells us in very sort of poetic terms. Dor holech v'dor ba v'ha'aretz le'olam excuse me. V'ha'aretz le'olam omadet. One generation comes and one generation goes, but the earth stands still. V'zarach hashemesh uva hashemesh, the sun rises and the sun sets. Ve'el mekomo, and it goes back to its place. Nothing changes in the world. Everything is fixed. Now, not only is nature fixed, right? We know that there are laws of nature, but human nature is fixed, and the place you have in society is fixed. The societies of antiquity and of empires were stratified societies. They persist to this very day. You're born to who you will be, and you can't possibly be anything else but who you're born to be. Pharaoh was born to be Pharaoh and to rule, and you were born to be a serf. And then there were nobles who were born to be nobles. And all this was set in motion and remains in motion as long as the empire survives. until, the hubris of the emperor leads to its self-destruction, which is part of what we read, and that's the story of Egypt. Israel is the mechanism that sort of utzes Pharaoh to his end, in a way, which is seen as a natural consequence of the arrogance of a human being to claim that he has the right to enslave a population. Okay? So the nature of the nature religions is that they rule over societies that are highly stratified, as I say, and where your role and the possibilities that you have are predetermined. You live a determined life. The nature of the God of history, whose name is not a name, whose name is a process, the God of becoming, the nature of that God is that God is not yet. We have the chutzpah to claim that the God that we affirm and that we relate to is a God who's still becoming along with us, because change is a possibility in this world. That's the great, it says, redemptive message of the God of history. History means development. History means new possibilities. And the God of history means, in terms of historical development, at least as the Jewish tradition and at least the Bible moves forward, it comes up with this sort of revolutionary notion that history has a redemptive dimension to it, and that humans can sort of facilitate that redemption. That tradition talks about a Messiah. The value of the Messiah is not in the magic of the individual who's going to be the Messiah. I don't know anything about that. What I know is that the value of the Messiah is that it talks about the possibility that the world that we have now is not the world that has to be, that it can be different, and that it can be better. The world of Pharaoh is the world that has to be. It is, it will be, and it will always be the same. The world of the God of history is a world that is not yet, and that we don't yet know what it can become. And we don't even know who the people are who are going to emerge to make it become what it will be, because they could be anybody. It's not fixed, it's not determined. We don't know any rabbi, we don't know any holy person, we don't know anyone, any prophet who somehow is the one who's going to make it happen. It's unknown, just like God is invisible. That's the chutzpah. That's why it's such a difficult notion. We preach to the world that the God that we believe in, you can't know, is invisible. And some people thought that we were either fools or that we were deceiving in our notions, that it's impossible, but that our commitment to the invisible meant that we can never make a claim that we have it, right? Because if it's invisible, you can't have it. You can't control it. The pharaohs of the world, the priests of the pharaonic world, they tried and they claimed that they could control the gods, the natural forces. They knew the magic. So God, in the Exodus story, the first level is, I'm going to out-magic the magic. And I'm going to take their magic and I'm going to turn it against them. I mean, that's the way the story is told. By the way, it's not a story that you need to sort of claim happened the way it is. It's the idea, to me, at least, it's the idea of the story. I don't need to see dead Egyptians. That's not important. That's not what I want. What I want to see is people understanding that there's something wrong in a way of life that allows one human being to lord it over other human beings and to create a whole society of people who are oppressors over other human beings. And I want that message to get through, because I know it didn't end with Pharaoh. It didn't begin with Pharaoh. It didn't end with Pharaoh, and it persists to this very day. And we're not done yet in the process of transforming this world, unfortunately, in terms of the way in which, in terms of moving forward. So let me relate a few verses to you, and then we'll look at at a couple of the charts to see how it plays out in terms of the plagues. So in the first plague, in the plague of blood, in chapter 7, verse 17, God says, "Bezot teda ki ani Hashem." With this you will know that I am God, which means that I exist. Because what did Pharaoh say to Moses when Moses came to him and said that God said to let the people go? Remember what Pharaoh said to him?
I don't know Hashem.
Mi Hashem. Mi Hashem. Who is this? Who is this God? Pharaoh said, look, I know about gods. I have first of all, I am who I am, Pharaoh said. But besides that, on my shelf, I have a lexicon. And in that lexicon, I have the names of all the gods. And I check the lexicon, I'm looking at it, and I see there's no Yud Vave. This God doesn't appear. Tell me, what are you talking about? This religion, Moses, that this is all phony, right? Mi Hashem. So the first plague, God says, "Bezot teidaki." With this you will know that I am God. Then in the fourth plague, you see there's actually a pattern. We'll see the pattern again in a moment. In the fourth plague, God says, "L'man teida ki ani Hashem bekerev haaretz," so that you will know that I am God in the midst of the earth. That's the monotheistic claim. Not only do I exist, one God, but I'm in the earth. That means I'm with human beings. It's chapter 8, verse 18. I care. Bekerev. Kerev is karov. Kerev is close, near. The Hebrew word for relative, right? Karov. Kirva. Right? So ani Hashem bekerev. I'm there in the midst. I'm with you. And in this seventh plague, God says, Ba'avor teda ki ein kamoni b'chol haaretz. It's chapter 9, verse 14. With this, you will know that there is no other than I in all the earth. That is, there are no other gods. So let me say a word about that. I don't know. I have to say this carefully. The Bible is not itself completely clean of references to other gods. And it's not purely monotheistic. The Bible is sort of working out monotheism through the course of the development of Israelite history. And the Israelite people are the ones who somehow are given this mission to carry the notion of one God. They don't do it so faithfully. And that's why you have the prophets. The prophets are constantly ranting at them. I mean, see what the prophets say. Amos, Isaiah. I mean, what are they saying? They're saying, you people, you claim to worship God, you're immoral. You treat the vulnerable like dirt. You ignore them. And then you think you're devoted because you offer sacrifice. That's not what God wants. Yeah, offer sacrifices, okay. But be devoted to other people. That's what you need. That's what the idea of being a religious person is in the face of God in this monotheistic world. You're behaving like the others behave. They lord it over other people. They claim to have, they worship power. You've lost yourselves. So the Bible is working out this monotheism amongst the Israelites. And, it's a process. Because we are a people, remember, in the Haggadah, we also have a very honest tradition. It's one of the lines that I like the most in the Haggadah. I mean, this is a great way to start a story about yourself. Here you are, and you're telling your tale. It's in the middle of the Haggadah, but it actually is the beginning of one version of the Haggadah. We begin this tale by proclaiming we were idolaters like everybody else. I think it's a wonderful example of a sense of honesty and self-criticism and understanding. We're not different from anybody else. We're like everybody else. And we have the same inclinations and the same tendency that they have naturally, and we have to overcome them. All we have is we have this tradition that weighs on us and tries to push us in a particular direction. So if we take it seriously, it can have an impact on us. But we can't allow ourselves to rest on our laurels and claim, oh, you know, we're God's people. What do you mean we're God's people? How do you behave? Anybody can be God's people. They need to behave in a godly way. So there's no such claim that's a possibility. That's what Pharaoh claimed. I'm God. How can you say that? Right? So we have to learn not to make exaggerated claims about our value in the face of who we really are. Because we falter all the time. And we have to regain our step properly. So that requires a self-examination, sort of constant effort at self-examination. So anyway, the plagues do introduce God, and now you can look at you can look at the first page of the handout, and you see this effort here. It's not a one-to-one absolute effort, but it certainly gives you an idea of what I'm talking about. That each one of the plagues was paralleled or made reference to one of the Egyptian gods, and at least one of the Egyptian gods. There was a multiplicity of gods, and that the plagues, in a way, were intended to take out the gods. Let me stop here for a moment. I obviously have more to say about this, and see if there are any questions. Anybody have a question, a challenge, something? Because I've been talking straight.
If I may, I just really loved, so I appreciate you pointing out the patterns in the makot, in the first, fourth, and seventh, in God proclaiming and proving or showing that. In the first and fourth, you cited the language being Ani Hashem, etc. In the seventh, it's Ein Kamoni. Ein is it's Ani, but with right. It's which I love the playing like that with the language. That's what jumped out at me.
Okay, very nice.
It's I, and there's no one like me.
Right, that's right.
If I might, in reading over, this is Fred Roeder. I'm new.
Fred, yes, please.
Honey brought me in. In looking over the plagues, the one thing I'm missing is that Osiris to the Egyptians is synonymous, really, with wheat, with the crops. And without
here it's represented as the giver of life.
Yeah, I know, but he is seriously his representation is of wheat, and I could send you lots of references on that.
Okay.
What that means is that the plagues are not representing the god, but things that are destroying the god.
Yes.
Locusts eat the wheat.
Right. Exactly.
Okay, hail destroys the wheat.
Yes, exactly.
Okay, so the two things that are important in Egyptian society, wheat is paramount. That's the flood of the Nile. The other one is the cattle.
Is the what?
Cattle. This is what sustains the Egyptian society. So we have plagues that are attacking the pillars of Egyptian society, and therefore the gods.
Yes. Okay, that's right. And we'll see a little bit more. So it's what I'm saying is that this is an expression of the war between God and the gods, right? Using the plagues as the attack on the Egyptian gods, right? And to the extent, by the way, that I might say that wheat is a staff of life. You know, that maybe that's the extent to which we want to make the claim that Osiris is the giver of life, but I'll take your point. I found this chart in a book that is devoted to charts of the entire Bible, so it's quite interesting. And obviously, I take your correction seriously.
Oh, you know what?
Yes.
It's being recorded. Les is on there. We may not be able to get it because it's so late.
Hello?
That there may be too many.
Oh, I don't know if they're listening. Okay. All right. Now turn to the second side of that sheet, or the second sheet, and you'll see something else about the plagues. Is there any other question, please? Any other question? Okay. All right. So here you see the literary structure of the plagues, and what's interesting about it is that the 10 plagues are presented in 3 series of 3 plus 3 plus 3 plus 1. Now, by the way, there's another series that I've commented on before, that if you look at the creation story is a pattern of 3 plus 3 plus 1. The 3 plus 3 in the creation story, I mean, it's important for us maybe to have that in the back of our minds. On the first day, light was created, right? On the second day, the waters above were separated from the waters below. On the third day, earth was created. All right, so what do you have? All right, on the fourth day, the sun and the moon and the stars. That's parallel to light. On the fifth day, you have birds and fish. That's parallel to the waters above and the waters below, day 2. And on the sixth day, you have animals and humans. That's parallel to day number 3. So you have 3 plus 3, culminating in 7, the Sabbath. Right? That's the culmination. Now, what's the pattern about? Now, the pattern, and here you have a pattern that indicates, you know, in each series of plagues, the first of the series begins with God's command, hit yatsev, station yourself. The second one says, boel paro. And then the third one, there's no instruction of that sort. Same in the second series, same in the third series. And what's striking about these series is that the first 9 plagues are all performed by Moses and Aaron. Only the 10th plague is God's plague. I'm going to come to that in a moment. So the first point about patterns. Patterns in the Bible indicate intentionality, not happenstance. This is not just a happening. There happened to be a plague because so-and-so. This is intentional. And the intention is the moral of the story. In other words, this is about what we can learn from the story. That's why we have this intentional series. And the message of intentionality is an attempt to claim that there's someone who's causing it, the cause of causes, who's making this happen. So this is the way the text communicates to you, one of the ways, that this is God doing this. Now, the first 9 that took place were forms of magic. That's why Moses and Aaron were the messengers, implemented those plagues. Moses, because in fact, the first 2 plagues, Pharaoh's magicians could perform. The others they couldn't. So Moses and Aaron had extraordinary magical powers given to them by God. I mean, understand, for this purpose, right? But the final plague is what is, you know, is what God, it represents God coming in and God making the claim, I'm the giver of life and death. Now, the importance, it seems to me, of the final plague is that it attacks everybody. And the verse is explicit in saying, Mibchor paro hayoshev al kiso, from the firstborn of Pharaoh. All the other plagues affected Egypt. The 10th plague hit home. And it was the final step in unseating Pharaoh. And that's what it has to be seen as doing. Now, why? Why did the plagues have to take on this form of violence, let's say, violence? And violence against life, against all life. And what was that all about? So for that, I actually, there are a series of articles. If someone's interested in reading, I would say that it's a good read, and it's interesting. I would recommend that you read what Sioni Zevet has written. He's written more than one article on the subject. His last name is spelled Zevit. The first article that he wrote on the subject was in Jewish Quarterly Review in 1976. If you want to look it up, and what he does there is brilliant. He demonstrates that there are phrases in the plague narrative that are drawn from the creation story. I'll give you an example. You know, in other words, this is something about biblical interpretation that I think is important for you to know. Whatever you think about biblical authorship, God, human beings, you know, because I like to talk about the divine author, right? Whether it was a divine author, right? It was really so the divine author purposefully referred from text to text. In other words, the Bible is a book that consciously refers to itself. It's self-referential, and it interprets itself. One part on another refers back to another one. And we have to be alert to specific wording that's used, because it's used for, it's not just, again, it doesn't happen to fall in there. It's no different, by the way, from good literature, where the writer is careful in the use of terminology, and the use of particular terms is extremely meaningful in a particular context. So, for instance, let's take the second plague, because it's the most, in many ways, the most striking of all. In the plague narrative, what we read is V'sharatz hayaor tzfardeim, that the Nile will swarm with frogs. Now, I think many of you will recognize by heart, whether you are aware of this or not, you know this. In the creation story, right? Chapter 1, verse 20, it says, Yishritzu hamayim sheretz nefesh chaya. The waters shall swarm with life. That's creation, right? The same word, sheretz, is used specifically. Let the Nile, which is the giver of life, instead of giving life, swarm with frogs, be filled with frogs. Let the Nile, that's the giver of life, become bloody. In other words, what am I describing? Let life become death. Meaning, the plagues are an indictment of Pharaoh. The indictment is, Pharaoh, you turned creation, you reversed creation. You took the order of creation and you transformed it into chaos. You undid the world. The world is a world in which human beings are given the possibility of freely serving before God. You undid humanity and nature in the process. And therefore, what you did is you brought devastation on Egypt. It's not that God brought the plagues on Egypt. Pharaoh brought the plagues on Egypt, right? Even, I mean, when you think about this, he caused the downfall of the Egyptian empire. It's only the story, right, that presents us, because it's a great drama. You know, everyone saw the Ten Commandments. You know, it's an amazing drama. This little people that sort of comes to Egypt and they're slaves. They cause the Egypt to fall. It is true, by the way, that the Torah's story is the first story in history of a slave rebellion. Nobody knows about that possibility. No, before the Bible, nobody knows that every human being has the right to dignity and freedom. No one knows that. Everybody knows that if you have power, you naturally rule over others. And Nietzsche saw that as the way of the world, and that the Jews subverted the way of the world with their notion that the weak are the ones that God listens to. Who ever heard of anything like that? Only people who are weak claim that God listens to the weak. You know, I mean, it's all rulers ruled claiming that they're God's representatives. That's the point. Well, how do they know that? Because they have power, and their power is a reflection of the fact that God chose them. And you have kings throughout history who claim divine right. You don't have to be a king. You can be an elected officer of a government and still claim that God chose you. We see that today. That's the problem. Authoritarians rule in the same mode and making the same claims as if they were chosen and that they have the right to inflict upon you in a whimsical way, whatever they think, in order to be able to maintain their power. That's what they're doing. They're preserving their power. They're chosen to preserve their power. Here comes along Israel. And undoes with its slave rebellion this notion, right? That's what's happening here is the undoing of the oppressive regime that rules by its arrogant claim to have sort of the divine right to rule over other peoples. Now, among the plagues, we see this explicitly, right? If we want to understand this, we see that light is turned into darkness, and that's very poignant, because in the biblical description of light and darkness, and by the way, we can go through all the plagues and see, how they're sort of undoing creation. Earth that brought forth life is bringing forth lice. I mean, and so you see that what's happening. All of living beings, the animals, the cattle, they're sort of undone. They in the creation story, you have this celebration of the fact that there is that God has created animals, cattle, and all forms of animal life to be creative in the world. The plagues come along and destroy that capacity. They attack those very animals that are mentioned in the creation story. And in the light and darkness contrast, what the story tells us is that although in Egypt there was a palpable darkness, in Goshen, which is where Israel lived, there was light. And that sort of really struck me. And I tried to understand the other day what this light was all about. Because, what does it mean? And what is it describing? Because, what had naturally occurred by the plague is that there was darkness instead of light. How come there was light? Why did the sun shine in Goshen? How's that possible? So my conclusion was, and I went looking for this and I found it, that it couldn't have been that the sun was shining in Goshen, because there was no sun. That's the point of the plague. The sun was obliterated. What's the sun? You know this. The sun is Ra. Ra is a main god of Egypt. The Hebrew word for evil, Ra, is the name Ra of the sun god in Egypt. Am I right, Fred, about that? I mean, I want to make sure I'm right. And Choshech.
Okay, actually, Ra is one of the names. Horus is the other.
Okay, all right, but it's not wrong. Okay.
They're actually coming from different periods.
Okay, good. Okay, all right. So the Choshech is directly attacking Ra. So the sun was obliterated and eliminated. So what we're left with is understanding that the light in Goshen was the light of God. That's the only possibility. It was the light of the first day of creation, because the Torah begins with creation of light. That light can't be the light of the sun, because the sun wasn't created until the fourth day. So there's some sort of spiritual energy that unfolds into the world. And what Israel experienced was an awareness of its spiritual connection as against the natural, material, oppressive culture of Egypt that had turned into darkness, that had basically obliterated itself. Because in the end, life is turned into death, and creation is turned into catastrophe. So that's the plague narrative and the use of motifs and phrases from the creation story to emphasize that what Pharaoh was involved with was in the undoing of creation. Now, this is borne out in a rabbinic teaching that appears in Pirkei Avot, in the Ethics of the Sages, Ba'asara ma'amarot nivra ha'olam. The world was created in 10 statements where God said, Vayomer, let it be. God said, and let it be. So in the creation story, that phrase appears 10 times. The 10 plagues are intended to represent the undoing of the 10 times that God said, let it be. And to sort of push the idea further, as is presented by Sfademet, a Hasidic rabbi, who claims that therefore the world that had been undone by Egypt and the chaos that from which Israel emerged had to be reestablished through the 10 Commandments, which re-gives creativity and stability and reconnects the people to the source, to the spiritual source that they have to carry with them. And that's the source of freedom that stands up against, it's Anochi, it's I am the God. Who am I, by the way? What's the first statement in the 10 Commandments? It's so striking because all of us are struggling. It doesn't seem to be a commandment, it's a statement. I am the Lord your God who took you out of the land of Egypt, right? But that's not all it says. It says, I am the Lord your God who took you out of the land of Egypt, the house of bondage. So the question is, why did it have to say the house of bondage? It would have been sufficient to say, I'm the Lord your God who took you out of Egypt. It says, I am the Lord your God who took you out of the land of Egypt, the house of bondage, in order to teach you who God is. God is the redeemer of slaves. Right? That's who I am. It doesn't say I'm the Lord who created the world. I'm the Lord who redeems slaves. Why is that important? Because Rabbi Soloveitchik taught us that there's no declarative statement or narrative in the Bible that doesn't have a normative dimension to it. I mean, that's a sort of typical Lithuanian insight looking for the norm. So the question always is, what's the norm? What's the norm that we can derive from a statement that declares, I am the Lord your God who took you out of Egypt, the house of bondage? Well, the norm is imitatio, right? V'halachta bedrachav. Just like God redeems the slaves, so too must we redeem the slaves. So the mission of Israel that recognizes the one God of Israel, the Redeemer, who understands that history means that what is today need not be tomorrow, is that you, Israel, are given the task to make sure that in this world that you undo, that you eliminate, that you struggle against slavery, which is something that's sustained throughout history, that we need to continue to struggle against. And that you have to become, throughout your lives, redeemer of slaves. That's the value that you take in, and that's the value that you pursue, and that's how you try to add value to and meaning to your life. Because what you do is you introduce humanity, you introduce people to their potential. You need to be able to do so in a way that allows them to recognize their capacity to have a sense of dignity as individual human beings who are created in God's image. So this battle in Egypt is a foundational battle. It really sets the stage for understanding what the role of religion is in life and why God is significant as a model, as a teacher. God is teaching us how to be human beings. At least that's how it's presented. That's how it's presented. Okay. Now the last aspect. So what we've done is we've seen how this is a battle between God and the gods. We've seen how the plagues actually represent a pushback against Pharaoh, who undid creation and who transformed creation into chaos. And the last aspect of that completes the argument. And that argument runs as follows. I'll make the argument as follows. The Lord, that is the Pharaoh, who claims to have the right through his power and through his divinity to lord it over and rule over and master other human beings, to objectify human beings as his servants, that Lord also will not stop and not refrain from objectifying all of creation, because everything was created to do service to the Pharaoh. So that same Lord not only abuses human beings, but that same Lord abuses the environment. So the story of the plagues is a story of a great environmental catastrophe that befell Egypt. Egypt, which was a breadbasket, Egypt, which was a creative economy, Egypt, which thrived in its power, right? In this tale, in this story, is undone. And its very life-giving force, and that which gave it all its strength, actually becomes its undoing. And the Pharaoh ultimately really does himself in. Now we have examples, which I gave you one in the handout, of recorded environmental catastrophes in Egyptian history. I mean, it's interesting because the actual document itself dates to a period close to when Israel was to have been in Egypt. So I actually should say the following: whoever is the author of the Egyptian cycle had great familiarity with Egyptian culture and with and with aspects of Egyptian religion. I mean, maybe not everything is precise. I don't know, but there are the terms that are used. Even the name Moshe. I mean, the name Moshe is an Egyptian name, so there is intimate familiarity with sort of the nature of that society, so we have this document that emerges in that period, and who knows what's lurking in the back of the minds of the people who are writing this literature, and whether this was in any way a factor. But it's called this is called the Admonitions of Ipuver, and over to the right, those of you who have the page, you'll see in paragraph 10, there's a 10 on the right-hand side, where there's a declaration. Why really the river is blood. If one drinks of it, one rejects it as human and thirsts for water. If you look above, let's say, look at the third line. Why really the Nile is in flood, but no one plows for himself, because every man says, we do not know what may happen throughout the land. Why really women are dried up and none can conceive. Noom cannot fashion mortals because of the state of the land. So there's no creativity that's possible at this point. Everything seems to be going upside down. So this is a description of a type of catastrophe that literally befell Egypt. And there's another one that is reported. It's in a text. It's in a collection called Ancient Near East in Text. Some of you may know the collection by Pritchard. It's called The Divine Nomination. I'm sorry, that's not the one. It's called The Prophecy of Nephi Rohu. And there we have sort of similar descriptions of the demise of Egypt, and a report that's being given to the Pharaoh of how Egypt has been weakened. And we know that there was a period in between the kingdoms where the great Egyptian empire, suffered and was almost, and was lost and had to recover and rebuild itself. All right, let me say a couple words. So there are three aspects here. One, the first aspect is monotheism and paganism, right? And the battle between the God of Israel and the gods of Egypt, and the consequence of that, meaning that humans have created in God's image, not that they are servants. Second aspect is that there is a reversal of creation itself, and that reversal of creation is somehow linked to an environmental catastrophe. And the general conclusion, and it's something that I'm going to come back to this in a moment, that we need to know that rulers who rule arbitrarily and don't have respect for human beings, and who see humans as people who are mere objects, they see everything. They objectify everything. and they feel they have the right to use and abuse all resources, because it was all put there for them and their use. And that there's a link between environmental disaster and human oppression. And that we ought to think about that in terms of how we navigate our world. And it seems to me that's something we ought to think about in terms of the current crisis. Now, a friend of mine, and I'm not going to bore you with it, but he actually made up a sheet with a parallel column of contemporary plagues, environmental plagues, parallel to the plagues of Egypt, so that it gives us a sense of what we can sort of meditate on when we're reciting the plagues, and understand the plagues didn't just happen, they're happening. They're still happening in our time. Right? And we are in fact partially responsible. And we have some responsibility here, because we haven't paid attention, and we've taken natural resources for granted. So it's not only the fact that there's a task of redeeming human beings and giving them dignity, it's about redeeming creation itself. What's the lesson here? The great lesson here is that we always thought that because humans are higher order than other aspects of nature, that there's a hierarchy that privileges us. Now, indeed, we do have a sense, we are privileged in terms of our capacity to think and to make moral decisions. But the reality is that we're part of a continuum, a natural continuum, and we're part of the world. And if the world goes, we go. And our task is to make sure the world continues. And we're doing a bad job of that. And I may as well mention it now, right? There's some people have asserted that the abuse in terms of practices, eating practices, where all wild animals are prey to human consumption, that might be the direct cause of the virus that's spreading today, and that we need to limit the way in which we abuse the world around us and pay attention, because otherwise we become a factor in the spread of these plagues that surround us, that we can't see, that overpower us. Maybe, the NPR reporter asked Yuval Harari what we can learn from this. And Yuval Harari said, perhaps we will realize that we are just animals, despite our immense power, and are not invincible, but are part of the natural ecological system. Maybe it will change how we treat this system. So we're not invincible. Pharaoh saw himself as invincible. The result of his invincibility is catastrophe. And let me say the following: every great empire, that's the problem. I know there are a lot of you here. I hardly see anybody. But if you're like us, there are a lot of you who like to travel around the world. We look at great monuments all the time. Who built all these great monuments? We love it. We were just at the Taj Mahal. Who built these monuments? Slaves built these monuments. Slaves, mostly. And the monuments were built to human beings as a way of human beings claiming their eternity. And that's all right. So thank God. I want to say thank God a million times, thank God, that we live in a civilization that has no monuments. I know there's some people who don't like that, and they want to build another monument. But what's left of our great monument is an outer wall and a destroyed temple. That's our great monument. It should remain that way, which is a great way of understanding who we are. Monuments are inconsequential. It's the teachings that live on. It's how we live. It's the values that live on. That has life. Egyptian monuments are there, but the ancient Egyptian culture is there in the books only. We have no monuments, and our culture lives. We're still interpreting the texts from antiquity and trying to make them meaningful in our lives and trying to claim that they have meaning for everybody. That's an eternal life. That gives me a sense of purpose and meaning, even though it's not a piece of stone that's going to survive forever. The ideas, and the people are going to argue about that. And they may not even agree with what I have to say, but they're going to argue about it. The ideas will live. That's a great gift that we have to bequeath and to carry on. So a number of years ago, let me stop for a moment. Anyone want to ask a question here? Because I'm going to conclude with a quote. Anyone has a question? Because I've said a lot.
Chaim, it's Gary Richwald. Can you hear me?
Gary.
Hi, Gary. So, should we be concerned, or am I hearing you correctly, that these plagues could be plagues on us? I think about the LA Times article a week ago about the return of locusts to Somalia and other parts of Africa, secondary to global warming issues that affected the Indian Ocean, which seems a long way away, but obviously it isn't that far away. How do we think about these plagues in terms of threats to ourselves, to our body politic, to our religious structures? Where do we place these in that context, or not at all?
Well, so I think that we have a lot of hard conversations to have. I think we should maybe listen a few times to Jared Diamond, and begin to learn a little bit about it, the interconnectedness of humanity and the natural world, and understand that when plagues occur in different parts of the world, they have consequences for everybody everywhere else in the world. And that we need to develop some strategies about how we're going to survive in this world. And the only way that can happen, I mean, it's one thing, for individuals to pursue the right and the straight, but governments have to there has to be a sense of global unity, which seems to be so elusive these days. There's no leadership pushing in that direction. We need to look for leaders who understand, maybe after this virus, maybe, that we're all intertwined, and unless we get our heads together and work together, that, it will be consumed or we're consuming ourselves gradually. I mean, I don't like to be a doomsday prophet, but, and I'm old enough, I guess I worry about the world that I'm leaving behind. But I don't, and it's not something that's going to happen in 100 years. There's a process that's unfolding here, and we don't seem to know what to do, and we're sort of flailing around. And I think that our religious leaders have to become part of this conversation. That's part of their task. The religious leaders don't have the answer, but they need to be part of the conversation with scientists, with people, with politicians, with people who make policy, and think, and the community, to think about how we can proceed in this world. And I'm sorry to say it, I really don't see it happening. I don't see anybody who's sort of stepping out and the figure who's trying to get people together in that way. So I hope that I'm wrong and that someone emerges. There are some young people who are on this call. Maybe one of them will emerge in the future. I don't know. Let me relate back to someone who did emerge at a particular time and who actually made this argument in his own way without talking about the Exodus from Egypt and without talking about Passover. And that was Vaslav Havel. In 1991, Vaslav Havel gave a speech at UCLA in Royce Hall, and I was there. And I remember, those of you who don't know who Havel was the leader,
Czech.
The spiritual leader of the Czech Revolution, Charter 77. I actually had a little hand in that process, because when I was in Czechoslovakia, in 1984, I was leading a group, and in front of the synagogue, I met a young man Jewish man who refused to go into the synagogue because he said they were all collaborators. So he asked me if I would smuggle out some letters to Havel, who was then in London. So I was silly enough, Doreen wasn't with me, so I stuck the letters in my shoe. And when I came to the airport, I looked around. There were booths where they used it. They didn't do it when I came there, but clearly the booths were for body searches. Anyway, I got the letters out. I sent them and I mailed them. So the Havel led what's known as the Velvet Revolution, and then he became the prime minister. And he talked about the devastation of communism, and he gave this speech, an amazing speech. In Royce Hall. And so I'm going to quote from the last couple of paragraphs what he said. He said as follows: "The communist rulers of Czechoslovakia operated according to the all or nothing principle of après nous le déluge. Hoping that no one would notice, they secured absolute power by bribing the entire population with money stolen from future generations." That's such a great sentence. They bribed the entire population with money stolen from future generations. Miners extracting low-quality brown coal from strip mines, coal that was then burned without filters, were grateful for the chance to buy VCRs, and exhausted after a day's week, eyes glued to the screen, they failed to notice the pus flowing from the eyes of their children. Their wives noticed. Glad as they were that their husbands were earning relatively decent wages, they began to suspect what those wages represented. They began to realize that if the wages were lower, and the difference invested in cleaner, more efficient means of energy production, their children would not have chronic conjunctivitis. Après nous le déluge is the principle of a man who is related to no order, but that of his own benefit. It is the nihilistic principle of a pharaoh, right? Of a man who has forgotten he is but a part of the world and not its owner. Of a man who feels no relation to eternity and styles himself master of space and time. Master, and who has no sense, I would add, no sense of mystery. It's all his or her mastery. It's most probably his, because they're the ones who did it. I believe, said Havel, that the devastation of the environment brought about by the communist regimes is a warning to all contemporary civilization. I believe you should read the message coming from our part of the world as an appeal against all those who despise the mystery of being, whether they be cynical businessmen with only interest of their corporations at heart, or left-wing saviors high on cheap ideological utopias. Both lack something I would call a metaphysical anchor, that is, a humble respect for the whole of creation and a consciousness of our obligation to it. It is not my intention, says Havel, to lecture anyone, least of all teachers and students of UCLA, of this esteemed university, but I have felt it necessary to share with you the philosophical experience that I, like so many of my fellow citizens, have gained in the environment I come from. I would say that this experience is the principal article we can and should export from our country at this time. Last sentence. Were I to encapsulate this experience in one sentence, I would formulate it as follows. If parents believe in God, their children will not need to wear gas masks to school, and their children's eyes will be free of pus. Thank you. Take care of yourselves, all of you. Be well. Chag Sameach. Really take care of yourselves and take care of others, of your family around you, and celebrate the fact that you can be, even over Skype, with your family, right? That we still have each other, and look what we can do in terms of learning with each other. It's not the same, I think if we were together, we would be at it a little bit more. But I just want to say that I wish you all the best. And those of you who have a few more minutes, I'll show you just a couple of pictures from the Haggadah. Okay, so take care, everybody.
Thank you, and Chag Sameach.
So actually, I'll just show you one picture because this is worth it all. This is a centerpiece in what's called the Morse Haggadah. It was designed by David Morse. A lot of you know who he is. But this is a passage that says, in every generation, everyone has to see themselves as if they
mirrors.
right? Can you see that? And you see the mirrors.
Yeah.
Now, mirrors, the way he constructed the page, but this is based, by the way, on a manuscript that he made. This is a facsimile. He issued this facsimile, this one, in 500 copies. And the mirrors you see are between images on one side of the page of men and the other side of women, and they're all dressed in period costume. And the men and the women are reflected in each other's mirrors so that they see each other in every generation. But I want to say something else that's relevant to our lesson today. That when you look at the mirrors, the point of looking at the mirrors is to understand that the task before us in talking about liberation and God and so on is to look inside ourselves. And the mirror is sort of a mirror against ourselves and say, take a good look and see who you are and how you measure up to who you're supposed to be and who you could be. So everybody, maybe that's what I'll say, that's my wish to you. Take a good look in the mirror and understand the look in the mirror not as a sign of, an arrogant sign of self-pruning, preening, but a sign of really self-assessment and how we measure up in terms of our responsibility and our obligation in the world. All right. So enjoy, and be well most of all. These are hard times and scary times. So stay in touch. Chag Sameach.
Chag Sameach.
Chag Sameach. Thank you.
Send me emails if you have any questions and
Thanks so much.
keep the communication going.
Chag Sameach. Thank you.
Can we ask you a question, Chaim?
Absolutely.
So how did rabbis of thousands of years ago, is there any, or even 1,000 years ago, how did they practice in the face of periodic, whether it was bubonic plague, whether it was, how did they practice in the face of the kinds of threats that we're having today?
Well, so first of all, in the bubonic plague, there was not only did they suffer from the plague itself, suffered externally because they were accused as being the bringers of the plague, the cause of the plague. So there was a sort of a double crisis, and there was a lot of suffering, and when you ask me how they dealt with it, I think that traditional communities tended to see plagues as God's hand, right? And that they interpreted things as one reaction is, what do we need to do to refine ourselves? That was a classic sort of Jewish response. There's something problematic with that. I mean, you can't blame yourself all the time, but it's not so much blaming themselves as saying, what is our responsibility in terms of what we need to do to make sure that the world is a cleaner place, a better place, and that's the Talmudic teaching. When evil befalls you, yifashpesh b'ma'asav. Check yourself out, and see, and try to understand who you are. And it doesn't mean, by the way, that there's no external cause. But what it does mean is, even when there's an external cause, what's your role? I mean, I think that's such a hard message to communicate. People don't want to hear that. You can't, because they accuse you of blaming the victim. So you have to be careful about how you formulate this. The victim didn't bring it about, but having experienced it, the victim says, okay, what can I do to correct myself? And not only look and see it's their fault. So I think that was a Jewish strategy, and there's a redemptive dimension to that, Gary, because it means that you have to always fall on. I mean, aside from maybe people will say we blame ourselves too much, but then there's a creative side to it. You never let yourself sort of drown in being a victim and allowing victimhood to sort of encapsulate who you are. Because you say, I'm a responsible human being. What can I do to avert this in the future? I mean, they bewailed the sorrows. They wrote poetry about what befell them, for sure. But they also talked about how we have to proceed, how we have to go forward. It seems to me that if they would have allowed themselves to sort of constantly, Seidler Baron talks about this. He rejects what he calls the lachrymose theory of Jewish history. If they allowed themselves to cry all the time, then their eyes would have been filled with tears. They would have been able to read their books and to write and to create what they did throughout history. So they weren't crying all the time.
Thank you.
Is that an answer? I don't know, I hope. And anyone else? I mean, they didn't, by the way, I have to say this. I don't know, Gary, that there was any sort of global, I'm not familiar enough. You would need a good historian, that they have a global sensitivity or a consciousness that, that this, of what the cause beyond is. Because, they lived in the Middle Ages. I think that I would imagine there was a limited sense of historical cause and natural cause that they understood. We have a different grasp of things, and we see things for their sort of global meaning. Maybe I'm wrong, because the Romans, Roman historians had a greater sense. I don't know. I don't know enough to tell you about that. Perhaps it's time. It's almost 6:30, so I would say it's time. Unless there's another burning question. If you have a burning question, please. Otherwise, we'll wrap it up. All right.
Thank you so much.
All right. Shalom, shalom. Shalom to you all. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.